Ben was born in Southern California. He's an artist whose work is rooted in concepts of otherness and intersectionality, inspired by his queer, non-binary, HIV positive, and Latinx lived experience. So, yeah. All these multiple components inform his practice. Identity directly influences his artwork, which is interdisciplinary. An essential part of Ben's artwork is based in textiles, underscoring queer, feminist ideologies within the long and gendered history of women's work with fiber-based materials. Ben received his BA in mixed media, installation, and photography at Hampshire College in 2010. Ben's artworks have been shown across the US with exhibits held at the Craft and Folk Art Museum, which is now Craft Contemporary, Museum of the City of New York, the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York City, and many others. Several books and publication features Ben's work, such as Duets, Ben Cuevas and Annie Sprinkle in Conversation, published by Visual Aids, Queer Threads, Crafting, Identity and Community, edited by John Chase, is that right? And Tom Oldman. So with further ado, Ben, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak about my work with all of you. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Textile Arts Los Angeles for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to the Craft in America Center for hosting it and making all of this possible. So as Carrie mentioned, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. My work spans a wide range of media, including sculpture, installation, photography, video, performance, and sound. And I'm going to go into a deep dive into my body of work in textiles and talk about materials and meaning and process and give you an overview of my work. And then we're going to spend a little extra time on my most recent body of work, which is titled Non-Binary Code. It's part of an exhibition that's currently on view at Studio 203 in Culver City. It's up until January 13th, so I definitely recommend you go check it out if you get a chance. And two pieces of mine are behind us over here by the door. Those are two test pieces from the Non-Binary Code series, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to start out with the very first thing that I ever knit sculpturally, which was a heart. So I was at Hampshire College and taking a sculpture class, and the final assignment in that class was to make a sculpture out of any material that you want. And I had started to learn knitting around that time, and I was like, why don't I just try making something out of knitting? And I'd been really interested in anatomy all my life. In my sketchbooks, I'd always sketched hearts and anatomical diagrams. My dad was pre-med, and I used to pore over his anatomy books. They had the kind that you could color in, which I just loved as a kid, and that really stuck with me. So I had this sort of framework of anatomy in my mind, and I just tried knitting a heart, and it worked. And so I kept on knitting sculptural things and then eventually putting them into installations as well. So this knit heart in the bell jar here is part of this installation titled The Waiting Room. So this is part of an exhibition called Healing Disparities, the Condition of Embodiment. And this was my thesis exhibition at Hampshire College. It was installed at Canal Gallery in Holyoke, Massachusetts in 2010. And it uses fiber as a metaphor for life. It's really playing into the myth of the Greek fates who spin and measure and weave the tapestry of existence out of fiber, the fiber of the ether. So on the TV screens that you see here, I'm performing an act associated with each of the three fates of Greek mythology. In one screen, I'm spinning yarn, and another screen, I'm measuring that yarn, and then the third screen, I'm cutting yarn to signify, the end of the length of each life. And the waiting room here is circular because it's in the shape of a clock. There's 12 seats, one for each point of the clock. So as people interact with the space, they're literally interacting time itself in a way, symbolically. And the waiting room then spills into the hospital room where you see these other anatomical pieces that I've knit. So I've knit 7 anatomical body parts. This is the series. And each one corresponds to one of the chakras, the energy centers in the body. So there's anatomy that corresponds to these energy centers. And I also thought it would be really interesting to represent the inside of the body in a material that we usually associate with the outside of the body. This like reversal of opposites going on here. So here we have the thyroid and the brain and the intestines, a genitosexual piece, a third eye, another heart, and a rectum for the root chakra. For the genitosexual chakra center, I wanted to not privilege any one gender over another. So I wanted, and being genderqueer, non-binary, I wanted to like reference my own identity through how I was referencing that as well. So I put together the penis and the vulva and the testicles all together and created this form that you see here. And these pieces were all installed in a hospital room, really pairing the soft with the hard, the the Eastern with the Western philosophies of the body. Here's another view of it here. And I'd had a lot of experiences in the medical industrial complex that had made me feel, dissected and like alienated and in these like cold, harsh environments. So that's what I was referencing here in this work. And then after the hospital room, you go to the medicine cabinets. So these are actual medicine cabinets that I got from Home Depot. I took out the mirrors and I put plexiglass inside and put lights inside the back of them and turned them into display cases. Thank you. Each one of the pills in these medicine cabinets is one of the 5 most popular psychoactive medications. I, had been using knitting as a remedy for my anxiety and depression, and I found it very helpful with my mental health journey. But also I think, medicinal intervention can be very helpful as well. It's really up to the individual what path they want to take. But I wanted to reference all of that in my journey that I've been going through in this work here. So this is the first work I made after college. This is a piece called Transcending the Material. I made it when I was an artist in residence at the Wassaic Project in New York State. It's a really wonderful art residency, and they have a big arts festival at the end of their summer session. So I got to knit like it was my job for 3 months. Yeah, it was really amazing. And I really wanted to push the idea of anatomical knitting to its very limits. And I wanted to get to like the bare bones of what I could represent with this as well. So that's where the skeleton came in. And I knit the skeleton 1 bone at a time. There is an aluminum armature inside of it and steel going through the spine. And it's all sunk into a bucket of plaster that's hidden inside of this can of this pyramid of cans of condensed milk. Now, why condensed milk? A couple of reasons. First, Wassaic is the home to the first condensed milk factory in the United States, and I wanted to use a site-specific reference to the work that I was creating. And also, cans I see as a symbol of material culture. You can't really use cans in art without thinking of Andy Warhol and his use of cans as a symbol of materiality and material culture. So this skeleton is meditating on top of this symbol of materiality, as if trying to transcend that materiality itself. And then there's this cloud of screen prints above it, which are all photographs of my body with like anatomical overlays on top of them, as if they were evaporated from the form itself, referencing this desire to transcend material form. And my anatomical knitting continued here in this series of hoods that I created. This was a commission for a fashion conglomerate called Joyce Holdings Limited, and they commission artists to make work for their private collection. And I wanted to reference fashion and the idea of the garment, but I wanted it to be totally non-functional because I wanted it to be about being the object. I wanted it to be clear that this is an art object, not something that's like has utility. So I decided to make these hoods, but I didn't leave any holes for eyes or nose or mouth to accomplish that goal of making it not useful in any way. And I referenced each one of the different layers of anatomy here with the skull and the musculature and the veins. And the veins ended up being a test for this piece that you see here called Knit Veins. This piece I made while I was an artist in residence at Salem Artworks in New York State, in Salem, New York. And it was part of a textile exhibition that they had there, a large textile-based installation work. And I knit each one of these veins on a knitting machine. This was the first time I ever got into using the knitting machine. I had way more veins to make in the amount of time that I could knit it by hand. So that's why I chose to go by machine with this route. And it was amazing how much it sped up my output. And I ended up using the machine later in my work too, which we'll get into. But knit veins here, I really wanted to like play with scale and the idea of the viewer viewing themselves in relation to a body larger than the self. I was thinking of like, you know, we're all part of this body of humanity and all part of something larger than the individual self. So this piece here was the next work that I made in 2013. It's called Masculine Feminine. And this piece was kind of like my treatise on gender expression and how I view gender. So we have these like two poles, this polarity of the masculine and the feminine, and they're these idealized, unobtainable forms. And then covering it, we have this patchwork of I like to think of them as expressions of gender identity. Each one of the patches that you see here reference the phallus or the vulva in some way. Also playing with like absurdity around gender too. And, you know, and there is nothing in this piece saying that, you know, the phallus or the vulva belongs to one gender or another. It's all mixed up and could be, you know, expressed in any way that of this patchwork. So I started to get really interested in the idea of knitting as performance. And also I was really influenced by Judith Butler's ideas around gender performativity and how we perform gender in our lives. And I was invited to do a performance piece at Art Basel Miami for a satellite show called at the Hotel Gathering. And for that piece, I called it Jockstrap, and I sat nude in a locker room and I knit myself a jockstrap from start to finish. People were invited to come in and watch. The locker room was also still fully functional while we were doing this. People were, you know, advised that, you know, there was filming happening and people could come in and see them. So we didn't have a lot of people using the locker room functionally for it. But I did have quite a few people come and sit with me. And it was like very meditative and kind of profound to sit there and like be creating this object that is very gendered and doing a very feminine act in a very hypermasculine space and queering expectations of gender in that way. There's some more of the jockstrap when I finished it. And then that led me to this piece, another performance piece called Man's Body, Woman's Work. I sat nude in an art gallery over the course of a 40-hour work week and knit myself a flesh-colored, degendered bodysuit from start to finish. Again, playing with ideas of gender and performance, but also like what activities are gendered in terms of work. I think it's really absurd that we have gendered ideas around, you know, what one person can do for work versus another. So I wanted to queer those ideas and to degender myself in the process as well. There it is, all finished at the opening. So this piece here is part of my HIV activism that I do with my work. So I'm HIV positive, and I, wanted to put that aspect of my identity into my work. And I got invited to be part of the series of trading cards, the Play Smart trading card series, which is sponsored by Visual AIDS. And it's a series of trading cards that come along with condoms and lube and have various strategies for safer sex practices. So I was invited to do PrEP for my card, and PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a pill that people can take if they're at risk for HIV to prevent HIV transmission from happening. So I was thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to impact my community and raise awareness through the work in this way. So here we are veering into a new direction in my work where I got interested in working in 2 dimensions. I've been doing so much 3-dimensional stuff and time-based stuff, and I wanted to see what happened if I tried making work for the wall. And I also was interested in going back to the knitting machine. And I was also really influenced by the internet and ideas around digital culture at the time. So that brought me to this body of work, which is a series called Tweetables. It features knit text in 140 characters or less. And I was, there was a hashtag at the time called activist pickup lines, which I thought was just hilarious. And I liked using this series as a way to give more weight and time to create like a snapshot of digital culture in a way, to create something more permanent out of a moment that's very fleeting. So this piece now is in the collection of El Museo del Barrio in New York. And here are some other pieces from that Tweetables series. No fats, no femmes, no thank you comes from a critique of internet dating culture, where there's often this like mask for mask, no fats, no femmes thing that happens in gay internet dating culture, which is really insidious. And I wanted to challenge that in the work here. I loved hashtag dad bod as a thing at the time, so wanted to give that a little moment. There is also a hashtag why not mom bod that I made as well. And then there were also just some pithy things like comment on this thread, or my other hobby is sex, and not mask for mask, but yes for yes. Thank you. And the Tweetables culminated in this piece here called Twitter Storm. So when Donald Trump nominated Tom Price to the head of Health and Human Services in 2017, I thought that was like a really horrible choice and could cause some really dire consequences for my community, for HIV folks, for Latinx folks, for people who have less advantages when it comes to accessing healthcare. So I went on a Twitter tirade about that, and then decided to turn that tirade into a piece. So that's where Twitter Storm here came from. And this was exhibited first at Loyola Marymount University and has traveled since then. So in 2018, I was invited to make work for an exhibition called Viral Illumination, which featured the work of HIV positive artists and artists who were working with ideas around HIV and AIDS. And this was a big art party happening thing. So I wanted to create a piece that really, that people could activate and use in this art party space. So I decided to create a lounge area out of pills. The piece is called Pillows, and these are all pills that I have taken at some point in the treatment of my HIV. And they're also pills that can be used as prevention as well. So it was a really great moment to give people a space to literally get comfortable talking about these more taboo topics. I really wanted to work against the idea of stigma around HIV and let people really get comfortable talking about these things together. So next, that brings me to my 2019 exhibition. I was invited to be an artist in residence at Boxo Projects in Joshua Tree. And while I was there, I was just so drawn to the land. And I really felt like challenged as an artist because I never worked with land specifically in my work up until this point. And it kind of felt like a huge departure from my practice. And I was like, thinking to myself, how do I tie the idea of the land into my work as a queer person? And then the question became, how do I, as a queer person, depict and represent the idea of land in the work in a way that is inherently queer? So I was thinking of, the history of depictions of the West, Joshua Tree being a very Western landscape, and how that history is this like very hyper masculine narrative of depictions of the West. And I wanted to challenge that by making work that was like very much steeped in femininity and through fiber-based practices. So I discovered this stitch called faggoted fringe. And faggoting is a lace making technique. And I just loved the linguistic pairing that it had with the idea of reclaiming the word faggot. And I felt that that was like a very inherently queer way to put my identity into the work itself. So all of these landscapes that you see here were based off of photographs that I took. I was gifted a camera from a queer elder friend of my family. So I was like looking through this like queer lens of the past that had been gifted to me and making this work that was inherently queer in and of itself through the faggoted fringe. And I liked the idea of fringe too, because fringe, like Joshua Tree felt like a place that was very much like on the fringes of society and queerness and, being LGBT, being Latinx, that often can feel very fringe as well. So I love that idea of reclaiming the fringe in this work too. So that brings me to non-binary code, which is my most recent work. This is currently on display at Studio 203 in Culver City. So for this work, I took the word non-binary and translated it into binary code. And using knit stitches for ones and purl stitches for zeros, I created this knitting pattern that spells out non-binary in binary code over and over and over. So it's a meditation on binariness through non-binary representation, quite literally. Here you can see the strings of zeros and ones. If you imagine each zero as a purl stitch and each one as a knit stitch, that's how this work, the texture of this work is created. And I'm going to get a little more into influences of this work too. But first I want to point out another aspect of this work, which is people are invited to put on these like genderless bodysuits. And they're actually invited to lounge in the work. Again, I wanted to create a space where people felt comfortable talking about non-binary identity, to talk about things that they might be uncomfortable talking about otherwise. And boy, it really is a comfortable space. Like the pillows just envelop you, and like there's also this sense of joy that comes over people too when they interact with this work that's really quite lovely and infectious in a really good way that I think gets people comfortable talking about gender in ways they may not think about gender otherwise. So here is the pattern up close again. If somebody wanted to, they could definitely take this pattern and they could knit their own version of the work. I think of it as being open source in that way, open source code. And the idea of code is really connected to knitting from its very start and to textile-based work in general. So this is an image of the Jacquard loom, which was invented by Joseph Marie Jacquard in 1804. And it's considered the first use of a computer language. The punch cards that you see here each correspond to, a different thing that the loom does. And it was like the first time that computing languages had ever been used for an applied practice. I was also very influenced by this piece called Crocheted Environments, also called Womb Room by Faith Wilding. It's a 1972 piece that was part of an exhibition called Woman House, where Judy Chicago, Faith Wilding, and several other women artists who were associated with CalArts at the time took over a house in Newhall and turned it into a giant art installation and filled it with different works. A lot of works about domesticity and like a lot of ideas and concerns around second wave feminism at the time. So I really love this idea of fiber as environment that inspired me from Faith Wilding's work here. And I was also influenced by the Rothko Chapel. I love this, this composition, this way that the work envelops you and provides a very meditative space for contemplating the work and contemplating the ideas behind the work. And you can see that referenced in the composition of the installation for this work as well. I was also influenced by Ernesto Neto and his use of textiles as an environment that can envelop people and people can fully immerse themselves in, and gave people the opportunity to do that in this work here as well. Now, I want to point out here where you can see the stitch work up close. There's this idea of the grid. Knitting is inherently a grid system. And also I wanted to call attention to the white or natural color of the yarn here, the undyed color. I wanted the stitch work to really be the focus of this series and didn't want color to influence like a read of the work. So that's why I chose a natural undyed color. And also with the idea of the grid and white and the idea of acrylic on canvas, I should mention that this work is all made out of acrylic fiber and it's mounted onto canvas. So they're all works of acrylic on canvas, playing with this idea of painting. And when you think of white grid paintings, you have to think of the work of Agnes Martin here. And Agnes Martin's work is like really about ideas of the sublime and like it's kind of like a spiritual calling to the work itself. And you can see that white grid playing out here as well. Here are some more of Agnes Martin's white paintings. And you can see the influence here on non-binary code. Agnes Martin also really resisted ideas around being gendered in relation to her work. Like she often had people refer to her as woman artist, and she insisted, you know, I'm an artist. We don't need another moniker on that. But also, but she also, you know, was, I think, aware of the importance of being a woman working in a very male-dominated medium at the same time. So I feel like there's like, she wouldn't have had the language for non-binariness to describe herself, and I wouldn't want to put that on her retrospectively. But for me, as a non-binary person, there is like this impulse to both claim and resist gender at the same time. And then also, I want to call attention to the aspect of the work where you can see the canvas peeking through. There's this idea of revealing and concealing the canvas. And that for me is a couple of reasons. First, I loved the back of the work so much when I was creating it. And I really wanted to bring the back of the work onto the front. And I also was influenced by this very silly meme that says, "You're invited to a gender conceal party." It was a reaction to the gender reveal parties that we've all seen on the internet. And I thought this was hilarious and tickled my non-binary heart. And I love the idea of revealing or concealing gender. I think as a non-binary person who presents more masculine and who was assigned male at birth, I'm often revealing or concealing aspects of my non-binary identity on a daily basis. So I wanted to have that idea of reveal, conceal in the work as well. Here you can see some of the process behind the work. I created everything in my home studio and had my entire space just taken over by this large scale work. And then in the gallery with a team of assistants, we strung up all of the canvases over the course of several days using cotton cord to string them all up. And yeah, and that led to the installation you see here, which I definitely encourage you to go check out. It's up until January 13th. And yeah, that's my work. Thank you so much for listening to what I do and to spending some time with my practice. I really appreciate you all coming here to learn about it. So thank you so much.